I've had a generally pessimistic view of human prospects since my first reading of The Limits to Growth in 1972. My whole adult life, I think I have spent in kind of the place where Greta Thunberg is. And that's one of the things that makes it so delightful to hear her say these things to all the so-called adults in the room, when in fact she is the only adult in the room. But yeah, there hasn't been a big change for me. It's just, of course, one still has hopes, and one still likes to see a little victory from time to time, you know, saving this patch of forest or getting this environmental regulation passed or whatever. You know, anytime something happens like that, you have to celebrate it with your friends and say, you know,
yes.
But at no point along the way has one of those occasions led me to think in my heart of hearts that, oh, industrial civilization is going to survive. We won't have to face, you know, some kind of huge economic and ecological reckoning.
Yeah.
I find just connecting with, being with, talking with other people who have that same perspective, who understand what we've been talking about for the last hour, is probably the most regenerative thing that I have going in my life. I mean, obviously, you mentioned I play the violin. I love music. I think, you know, if human life is worth preserving, then we should focus on what makes it worth preserving, you know? And one of those things is that we are capable of producing great beauty. And so I think the arts are, if everybody just spent their time making beautiful music and beautiful stuff and beautiful relationships and appreciating the beauty of nature, rather than, you know, focusing on making as much money as they can or as powerful weapons as they can or whatever, the next iPhone or you name it, the world would be a better place.
Well, Richard, what a delight. And I'm just thrilled that you can be part of this series. It's been about, what, 2 years, I think, 2 years ago that Connie and I had lunch with you. And
was it that long ago? Wow. It seems
I think
like...
so, yeah. It was 2 years ago, yeah. This particular series, it's very different than the one that I did 4 or 5 years ago on The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. I think I had more of an optimistic sense that we would transform the systems and that sort of thing. And I still think that can happen to some degree. But part of what I'm trying to get at in this conversation series around post-doom, and I'm defining post-doom as I'm defining doom as the midpoint between denial and regeneration, with or without us. I mean, Earth will regenerate and life will regenerate, and hopefully we can participate in that. And I see post-doom as that space that opens up when we remember who we are, that we are life becoming aware of itself, and accept what's inevitable and invest in what is pro-future and soul-nourishing. And so there will probably be, although I can't imagine there would be too many people who don't know who you are and what you bring to this conversation, but just for those who aren't familiar with the Post-Carbon Institute or haven't read your books, or help us get you, help us understand a little bit about who Richard Heinberg is and what you bring to this conversation, what you've been doing.
Well, I'm basically a writer and public speaker on mostly environmental subjects. Back in the late 1990s, I had written a number of books already on environmental topics. And in the late 1990s, I was invited to help create a college program, one of the first in the country on sustainability, at New College of California, which 10 years later went defunct. And at that point, I was invited to become a full-time fellow with Post Carbon Institute. I had been on the board of Post Carbon Institute since the organization was founded in 2003. And starting around 2003, I wrote several books on energy, mostly fossil fuel supply issues, and basically making the argument that even if we don't take climate change seriously, the fact is that the energy sources that fuel 85% of our modern economy are finite and depleting, and it makes total sense to find alternatives to them to reduce our energy usage and so on. But I've always seen the climate and energy discussion in the context of a larger limits to growth paradigm that I first became acquainted with back in 1972 when I was in college and read Limits to Growth and had my eyes open to the fact that society is on a basically unsustainable path, and it's not just any one issue. It's not a technical problem. It really has to do with population and consumption. So I've been writing about that ever since. I've written. I'm in process of writing my 14th book right now. So I'm kind of a writing junkie, I guess you'd say. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to say, just speaking personally, that it was reading you in the early 2000s on peak oil. I only became aware of some of your sort of more, what I call eco-theo, sort of bringing ecology and God talk. I mean, you didn't do it the way I did, but bringing together this idea of the necessity of relating to what we would call the ecosphere or the biosphere as an authoritative thou, not a lesser it. I only became aware of that much later, but your writings on depletion and overshoot, one of my favorite posts of yours to this day is the climate, something along the lines of the climate is not our biggest problem, overshoot is. And so I wanted to just ask you about this term post-doom, and then what language do you use in describing our deteriorating or contracting or, in the process of what William Catton, who we both hold in high esteem, carrying capacity deficit rather than carrying capacity surplus. How do you speak of our times and what's unfolding now?
I've used all sorts of different metaphors and terms to describe it. You mentioned William Catton. His main book was called Overshoot, and it's a very valuable concept in relating where we are. I use the word collapse a lot, although it's a loaded word and you really have to define it for folks. I talk about historical cycles of expansion and contraction. Some of the best work on that has been done by an ecologist, sociologist named Peter Turchin, who has created this enormous database working with his colleagues. He has a number of people he has working with him, and they've created a database of hundreds of historical societies, and they've been able to tease a tremendous amount of numerical data out of historical records about each of these hundreds of societies. And then they look at all of that data using computers, and they've been able to find clear cycles that societies naturally expand and contract. And it's very clear in his analysis that we're in the process of reaching a contraction phase. But of course, that's happening just as all this other stuff is occurring, climate change and fossil fuel depletion and so on. So instead of just sort of a gentle decline, we're facing something much deeper. So yeah, there are many ways of talking about it, and I've tried to explore as many as I can.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and I would imagine that many people that are participating in this particular series relate to you the way that I do, which is an older brother on this path that you've been articulating things related to our relationship to the future, our relationship to primary reality or nature, and as in a way that has then allowed us to find our own voice and our own sort of message within this larger context. And so really the heart of this particular podcast series is really allowing or inviting various guests to share their story, their pilgrimage, their journey, their experience of going from thinking things were fine or thinking things, you know, the myth of perpetual progress, as most of us who grew up in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s experienced or believed or just assumed, except if people like yourself that, you know, when you got limits to growth in the early 70s, obviously things must have shifted then. But, you know, anything and everything you'd like to share in terms of that, because anybody, what I'm imagining is every season, there will be millions more people who are ready for this kind of a conversation that were ready last season.
Yeah.
Anything of your own experience in your own life that can be of assistance in terms of processing that shift from carrying capacity abundance and to carrying capacity deficit, or, you know, or going from everlasting progress to something else.
Right.
And any episodes along the way, and how was that for you emotionally in dealing with that?
Right. Well, a couple of things I'd mention. One is that, you know, after I read Limits to Growth, my first response was to try to frame our human situation and possible paths through it in spiritual terms. And part of the reason for that, I think, was the fact that I grew up in a Christian fundamentalist household. And even though I rejected fundamentalism, I nevertheless wanted to find an answer to that within sort of spiritual framework. And so for many years, I pursued you know, different Eastern religions. I joined a cult. I looked for any way possible of framing the human predicament in moral theological terms that might help produce some kind of useful answer. Finally, by around the mid 80s, I'd sort of run out of steam in that direction. But I was becoming really interested at that time in anthropology as a possible way of shedding light on our predicament, because it was clear that you know, most of the problems of modern society have to do with, you know, the way we're living in cities and global capitalism and, you know, modern industrial production, all that sort of thing. And not everybody has done that throughout history. People have lived in very different ways. So what does it look like to live as a hunter-gatherer or in a horticultural society and so on? And so I did a lot of reading about anthropology. I went to Australia and interviewed Aboriginal elders and, you know, got to know their way of life as much as I could as a, you know, white guy from America.
Right.
And I found that, you know, very, very illuminating in terms of showing that there are and always have been alternative ways of living that aren't nearly as destructive as the natural world. But, you know, looking at archaeology, it's also clear that we've been compromising natural systems for a long time, you know, at least going back to the end of the Pleistocene. I mean, we've been responsible. Hunter-gatherer human beings have been responsible for the extinctions of many of the megafauna of the Pleistocene and so on. We've changed environments. In Australia, we brought fire to Australia and used it to transform landscapes. And Australia has never been the same. You know, this all started 45,000 years ago. So there's something more about us than even just industrialism. we are a species that is uniquely powerful, and we use that power for the most part to expand our ability to do things, to expand our carrying capacity. And we try sometimes to restrain that power in various ways. And a lot of the good bits of religion are exactly about that. But not only religion, in other ways, we try to restrain our destructive pursuit of power. But
yeah, if I could just jump in
yeah,
real
sure.
quick on that note particularly, because this is where I found the most helpful author. He's really become a rather significant intellectual mentor just in the last 4 years for me and Connie, is Teddy Goldsmith, Edward Goldsmith. And his work on The Stable Society, which was written in the late 70s, which was really a distinguishing of sustainable cultures that can live in place and continue to honor that place so the place is not decimated, and unsustainable cultures, those that live in place and destroy the place. That it turns out, and he also furthered that a lot more in his magnum opus, The Way, an ecological worldview. But it turns out that lifeways, or what we would call religion, but not religion as one subset of society, but basically the moral voice of society, that ensured, upon pain of death or ostracizing, that limits were honored as sacred, and that the future was never compromised by the present, or to say it another way, a sense of accountability to the future. And that if religion or life ways doesn't play that role, no other aspect of culture is likely to. And it seems like honoring limits may be the single most important thing, because as Ronald Wright talks about in his understanding of progress traps, that we're inventive, we're ingenious, we're amazing, but our own amazingness, our own progress, our own successes in capturing more and more carrying capacity can actually begin to cause more and more problems if we don't honor limits. And once we have overpowered all of the constraints the living world placed on us, the only way to be sustainable, the only way to become indigenous was to constrain ourselves, which is not easy.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, what you said. That's right.
Well, continue along the vein of sharing just your story, how you went from an understanding of progress, and then what have been the tools that have allowed you or supported you in coming to be aware of some really sobering, scary, at times depressing or frustrating stuff.
Yeah, well, I guess I should mention that in the 90s, I finally settled on energy as sort of a key to understanding the human predicament, because energy is implicit in everything we do. You can't do anything without energy. And the reason we've become so much more destructive in the last couple of hundred years than we ever were before is that we got our hands on energy supplies that were larger, more concentrated, more portable, more powerful than anything we'd had previously, namely fossil fuels. And so that's transformed, transportation, agriculture, how we live in our homes, employment, the creation of the middle class. Society has been transformed from the ground up as a result of our use of fossil fuels. And of course, they are depleting non-renewable resources, and as we burn them, they upset the climate. So this has been a self-destructive, but a self-destructive interlude in the human story. But it didn't initially appear to be so. For the first number of decades, and still in most people's minds, fossil fuels have been responsible only for good things, enabling human population to grow from 1 billion to nearly 8 billion today, increasing per capita consumption, creating the consumer way of life, and Amazon Prime and all the rest. It's all due to that truck that pulls up in front of the house with that thing we ordered 2 days ago.
I know that you and I both hold Jay Hanson and Walter Youngquist. At least I'll speak for myself. I found that Jay Hanson's work, and although I only came to the party rather late, but then also Walter Youngquist. So say anything you want about sort of your trajectory, because you've been the major writer on energy, certainly in terms of for a popular audience. I'm throwing a whole lot into this question, Jay Hanson, Walter Youngquist, all this stuff, but just take the ball and run with it wherever you want.
Well, gosh, you've mentioned several people who are, big influences on me. Teddy Goldsmith is one of them you mentioned a little while ago, who really started the British environmental movement. And Walter Youngquist, who wrote a book called GeoDestinies. He was a geologist and understood the finite nature of minerals in general, fossil fuels among them, and wrote very knowledgeably about that. Jay Hanson turned me on to the idea of peak oil back in 1998. And in some ways, I owe my first book, The Party's Over, to Jay. I mean, a lot of the key ideas in that book really came from, I was an early subscriber to his Brain Food series of email posts.
And you also, the first two chapters of that book, The Party's Over, you did such a masterful popularizing of a lot of William Catton's work and thinking as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you mentioned fracking, and at Post Carbon Institute, we have done some original research on tight oil and shale gas. What are the prospects? What are the limitations, and so on? And I think we've done some of the best work out there on that subject. David Hughes is our sort of in-house geoscientist who puts together these reports on an annual basis. And it's pretty clear that these are short-term plays. Individual wells deplete so rapidly, and the whole exercise is so expensive. All the companies that specialize in fracking are deeply in debt and losing money in most cases on every cubic foot of natural gas or every barrel of oil they produce. So it's really only the kind of Ponzi economy that we're living in that enables fracking to proceed. But nevertheless, that being the case, we've gotten a decade and a little bit more of reprieve from fracking, from what otherwise would have been a peak and decline in world oil supplies. And that decade comes at a crucial time, just when climate change is starting to really bite. And so, realistically, I think at Post Carbon Institute, our concerns and our thinking have generally shifted away from peak oil toward climate change. That doesn't mean that the whole peak oil discussion was wrong. It actually was very helpful, I think, for many people for understanding the role of energy in society, the role that fossil fuels have played historically, the difficulty in substituting for fossil fuels, and what some of the constraints are likely to be on economic growth in the next decade or so. So all of that, I think, was very useful, but nevertheless, the fracking boom has changed things.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, one of the things I just want to mention, because I think this will be maybe the only place or one of the few places in this series that I'll remember to mention, is that I was so impressed with Walter Youngquist's GeoDestinies that I actually began recording sort of the unofficial audiobook of it with Walter's permission. And he had been working for over a decade on a revision because it was published in 1997, of course. And he was working on a revision and it didn't get published prior to his death. And I've been sort of shepherding that. And it looks like now within the next 3 months, that a revised edition, updated, that Walter himself worked on for close to a decade. And it's exciting to see this book come back into print, and Social Contract Press is so committed to getting this message out that they're going to be making a free online version available for people that just wanted to download the PDF. as well as so it's going to see the light of day again. I'm grateful for that.
That's terrific.
How has the universe story, epic of evolution, big history, green history, how has sort of the larger perspective of time and space as our common creation story, how, if at all, has that informed you, supported you? I mean, Joanna Macy famously has said that the bigger story is part of what we need to have a sense of identity that sees ourselves as part of life, part of nature, not separate from it or not its masters, but also the sense of time that gives us a sense of the rise and fall of unsustainable civilizations, the difference between sustainable cultures and unsustainable cultures. How has that big picture supported or informed you or in any way nourished you in this process?
It's always there in the background for me. It's not something that I foreground as much as, say, Joanna does. And one sort of big picture thing that I find myself thinking about a lot is something called the Fermi Paradox, where the physicist Fermi said, well, we got a problem here, because if life is something that naturally emerges on planets, if they have more or less the right temperature and some water and they have a star nearby and so on, then chances are there must be billions of planets in the universe with conditions appropriate to the emergence of life. And of those billions, surely a couple of billion by now would have, arrived at the point where life would have gotten to where, the most intelligent life forms on those planets would be able to say, hey, we're here. Are you there? But where are they? I mean, of course, there are the UFO folks who say, well, we have that evidence, but that's not so clear. So setting that aside, why aren't we seeing hello signals all the time from other civilizations and other stars? And the neatest, cleanest response to the Fermi Paradox is to say, well, maybe on all those other planets, there were fossil fuels or the equivalents. And when they got intelligent enough to be able to start sending signals and spacecraft out into the larger universe, that was also a time when their growth trajectory became such that they started undermining their own viability as civilizations. Maybe this is a natural thing that occurs to civilizations if and when they get to the point of having this much power. So what's the next step in resolving the Fermi Paradox? So either when a civilization gets to that point, it self-destructs. That's one solution. That's one way of looking at it. Or it decides we have to do some self-limitation here. Or they burn up their fossil fuels and go back to living in a simpler way, or something like that. So, complete self-destruction of all intelligent life is not the only necessary response to the Fermi Paradox, but it's one of two.
Yeah, and it may be that simply defining advanced by how much power over everything you depend upon is. Maybe that's a rather insane definition of advanced consciousness, advanced civilization. To define, I mean, I forget if it was Scientific American or somewhere, where it had this picture of a galaxy, and then the question was, are we alone? The implication, of course, is our kind of conscious intelligence alone in the universe. And my first thought from a biospheric, from a living systems perspective, is that we're surrounded by millions of other forms of intelligence, that if we don't recognize them as forms of consciousness and forms of intelligence and think that our kind is the only measure of consciousness or intelligence that matters, then that may be the problem in and of itself.
Yeah, in many ways, I mean, what really sets us apart from other creatures on this planet is just human language. You know, every organism communicates, and they found the forms of life on planet Earth have found many ways to communicate in very effective ways. But human language, with its, you know, inherently meaningless symbols that we can string together according to the rules of grammar to create just incredibly intricate, complicated thoughts that are abstracted from the world out there, and that can become so introverted and self-referencing. That's really unique.
Yes.
And it really does set us apart. And so we have this attitude that if another creature doesn't have human language in that sense, it's not intelligent. It's not as good as us. We are, because of language, we are apart from the rest of nature. And you know, language gives us tremendous power, not just power to do things, physical power, but also social power, the ability to get other people to do things. It's been a huge evolutionary advantage, but it also just cuts us off and makes us miserable in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah, in college and seminary, one of my intellectual mentors was Walter O-N-G, Jesuit scholar, on, you know, the profound differences of human consciousness that shift from orality to literacy. And I know Paul Kingsnorth recently wrote, just in the last 6 months, something along the lines of, you know, really critiquing that when cultures, let's put it this way, we don't have any examples of literate cultures where literacy escapes the priesthood and becomes commonplace. Those tend to be self-destructive cultures. There's something about literacy that tends to remove us from thinking we are part of the body of life to that we are masters, that itself becomes problematic, to say the least.
Well, literacy, of course, is based on writing, which is the primordial technology of language. And then we've developed more technologies on top of that, from you know, printing to telegraph to radio to television to smartphones, and with every step, you know, the power of language increases. I mean, just look at what radio did for World War II. The power of the voices of Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. But you know, the level of power of language is increased by combining it with technology, with, you know, physical technologies, and so and along with the increase in power comes an increase in abstraction and disconnection from the results of the exercise of that power.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of that language is what facilitates the disconnection. By speaking of primary reality, our material source, sustenance, and end, by speaking of primary reality as merely the environment, nature, the language itself tends to have us live in a way that is superior, or imagined to be superior. Thomas very famously said, the environment is not our surroundings, it's our source, sustenance, and end. But if we treat it as merely our surroundings, then we deceive ourselves into thinking that we can use it for our benefit and as a place for our waste without negative consequences.
Yeah. So the environment is a category, along with the economy, and politics, and so on. And so you've got to take that one category over here and put it in relation to these other categories. And for most people, these other categories, because they involve language and people and power and entertainment and so on, are just a lot more interesting and take up a lot more mental space.
Yes.
Even though this other category of the environment just happens to be the thing that enables us to exist in the first place.
Yes, exactly. Well, this leads me into the next question, which is about human nature. You know, how does your sense of inborn human strengths and limitations affect your interpretation of societal or cultural deterioration?
Yeah, it's something I'm giving a lot of thought to these days. I'm actually writing a book on the subject of power. right now. And and we've already touched on a lot of this in our conversation so far. There's something called the maximum power principle that biologists and ecologists started thinking about in the early 20th century. And it basically states that the organism or system that is able to focus the most power tends to win in evolutionary competition. And certainly we've seen that as in the human world. You know, we found ways to increase our military power. And you look at the arms race all the way from stone tools up to drone warfare and robot soldiers. You know, we're constantly looking for ways to increase our power. And on the other side of the equation, you have the reality that too much power almost always leads to, you know, very bad consequences. And this is not a new thought. People have understood this for a very long time, and nature understands it too, because throughout nature there are checks and balances. And anytime one organism or ecosystem becomes unbalanced, anytime one organism has too much power within an ecosystem, it tends to be ultimately self-destructive. Things balance out. We're complicated creatures, and we have both of these things going on within us, the hunger for power and the means to power. And on the other side, we have the intellectual, spiritual, moral equipment to understand the consequences of too much power, and in many ways to do something about it. I mean, you look at human history and the efforts to limit power in whether it's human social power or human power over the environment or whatever. It's not just, you know, the EPA in the early 1970s and the first Earth Day and all this stuff. I mean, it goes way back to the early days in human history. In writing the book on power and the maximum power principle, I've come to think that we should really have a name for this other web of behaviors and thoughts. And I've taken to calling it the optimum power principle, because it puts time into the equation. The maximum power principle is basically instantaneous. At any given moment, the organism or a system that is able to focus the most power wins, okay, and we have evidence that that's true. But if you want to be able to sustain power over a longer period of time, bring time into the equation, that means you have to optimize power. And that's, I think, the challenge for humanity.
Yeah. Oh, I so agree. I like that a lot, that framing of it. I'll be looking forward to seeing it. What's the pub date? When do you imagine being done and published?
We don't have a publication date yet. It'll be sometime in 2020.
Yeah. Okay. On this notion of, or on this topic of human nature, I know that there are many people who formulate sort of an ideal plan that if we all just did this, if we all made these changes and these institutional whatever, then we could, you know, with some positive vision of the future. And they all seem to completely negate it. We would have to become a different species, you know, human nature.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I heard just this morning that Johan Rockstrom, the great climate scientist, European climate scientist that a lot of people listen to, has now just said, blaring trumpets, that the already developed nations, the wealthy nations of the world, should give up economic growth as a pursuit, which of course is something that Herman Daly has been saying for 40 years, and others of us have been saying for some time as well. And Greta Thunberg just yesterday at the United Nations said, here you are talking about economic growth, and we may not even have a future.
Her little speech was so prophetic, and I mean, brought Connie and I both to tears, as many others.
Right. Right. So this is basically the crux of it. If we are going to get through this without a a huge collapse in not only human society, but in the global ecosystem. We have to reduce the scale of our economy, reduce the size of the human population. And those are two things that very few people want to talk about.
And even those who do want to talk about have I've never heard a realistic sense, given human nature, not just in individual human nature, but the way groups of humans tend to respond and the way that power elite tend to respond in declining civilizations.
Right.
It's outside the realm of believability for a growing number of us.
It's a thought that can't be entertained. You know, it's like most people in power see it in terms of unilateral disarmament. Yeah. You know, basically, if I put down my arms and the other guy keeps his, then I've basically just surrendered. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the terms in which they think of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Richard, I'm curious. Just speaking emotionally, you know, I mean, you're brilliant, you're rational, but you're also an incredible musician. And so I know you've got this other sort of tender side. How has it been for you emotionally to adjust from genuinely believing that we could make certain changes to avoid certain unpleasant or catastrophic outcomes to, I imagine, less of that optimism? You don't typically have a happy chapter at the end. How has that been for you emotionally in coming to terms with
you know, I have to say that I've had a generally pessimistic view of human prospects since my first reading of The Limits to Growth in 1972. My whole adult life, I think I have spent in kind of the place where Greta Thunberg is. And that's one of the things that makes it so delightful to hear her say these things to all the so-called adults in the room, when in fact she is the only adult in the room. But yeah, there hasn't been a big change for me. It's just, of course, one still has hopes, and one still likes to see a little victory from time to time, you know, saving this patch of forest or getting this environmental regulation passed or whatever. You know, anytime something happens like that, you have to celebrate it with your friends and say, you know,
yes.
But at no point along the way has one of those occasions led me to think in my heart of hearts that, oh, industrial civilization is going to survive. We won't have to face, you know, some kind of huge economic and ecological reckoning.
Yeah. One of the questions that Connie wanted me to ask, I'm just remembering this now, that Connie specifically wanted me to ask you about is, you know, few people have experienced global weirding, climate catastrophe, whatever, more than the sweeping wildfires that came into your community. Share a little bit about that experience and what that has done to you, for you, and in your community, and anything you want to share about that.
Yeah, well, briefly, the story is that on a windy, hot October night back in 2017, we went to bed with a kind of unsettled feeling because it was hot and windy and weird, kind of weird. And my wife, Janet, even called the fire department and said, you know, hey, I'm starting to smell smoke. And they said, these are fires up in the hills. Unless you're directly affected, don't bother us.
And this is Santa Rosa.
This is Santa Rosa, right. And so a knock on our door at 3 a.m. and we open the door and it's our next door neighbor. And she's waking us up to point out the fact that, you know, our front door opens to the north and the entire northern horizon was in flame. And of course, the wind was blowing right in our direction. So we got our most important papers together. We put our 4 chickens in carriers and put it all in the back of our our little car and drove to the closest, you know, designated shelter. and waited it out. As it turned out, our home was spared, our neighborhood was spared. That wasn't the case for thousands of homes in Santa Rosa, and many of our friends lost everything in the fires. And for a while, everybody pulled together. You know, it was just amazing. Of course, for 10 days, there was no electricity. There was running water, but no natural gas, or nobody went to work. Everybody was just hunkering down in their homes, talking to their neighbors, sharing their food. So it was a remarkable time to sort of get in touch with the gift economy, how basically good people can be to one another in these sorts of times. And then, of course, capitalism reasserts itself, and because so many people were homeless, rents immediately began to skyrocket, and contractors began, some, certainly not all, but some contractors started, you know, profiteering off of, you know, rebuilding efforts and so on. So, you know, we got to see the whole range of human nature reassert itself in the wake of the disaster. And I think people in Puerto Rico have seen very similar kinds of things. But, you know, it's instructive to see it firsthand. Yeah. And you know, as we're speaking right now, it's the end of September. It's a 100-degree day here in Sonoma County. High winds are forecast over the next couple of days, and we could see the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, Richard. Yeah. Well, I'm going to switch the order of the final two questions that I like to ask. I want to ask this one first, which is related to remaining opportunities. What is your sense of what's beyond our control and where we still can make a difference individually and collectively? What's your sense of what's no longer possible?
Well, I don't know where that boundary is. You know, clearly there are a lot of things that many good people are hoping for, you know, changing everybody's mind and suddenly getting everyone on board with wind power and solar power, and, you know, creating a green New Deal future where everyone is happy and has a job and so on. It ain't going to happen. That ain't going to happen. But in a way, I'm not sure we need to know the answer to that question. Back when I was doing kind of this spiritual thing back in the late 1970s, one of the books that affected me deeply was the Bhagavad Gita, which is the great sacred text of Hinduism. Not obviously not the only one, but it's the one that's, I think, probably held in highest regard. And of course, the Bhagavad Gita is a conversation between Arjuna, who's on the battlefield, and all of his friends and relatives are out there about to kill each other, and he's going, "Oh, this doesn't look like a great thing to get involved in." And yet here I am, you know, I'm a soldier. I'm trained as a soldier. This is my duty in life to get involved in this struggle. And his charioteer, Krishna, is telling him, basically, the dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna is the substance of the Bhagavad Gita. And in the course of talking about the situation, they talk about all kinds of philosophical and moral and spiritual stuff in a very insightful way. But the upshot of it is that Krishna advises life is a battlefield. Enter it and take selfless action and do good for good's sake, and don't be attached to the results. And if ever there has been a time when that advice rings true, I think it's now. Yeah. You know, those of us who see what's going on, you know, it's easy to say, well, it doesn't matter what I do. The result is more or less foreordained. I can't be sure that anything I do will have any particular action. It might even have the opposite effect from what I intend. Nevertheless, here we are. We are the ones who have shown up for whatever reason. We have the knowledge, we have the whatever capacity we have to not to use that capacity in saving whatever we can of the natural world, in minimizing the suffering of other human beings as much as we can, would be to abdicate any moral authority that we have. So to me, that's the crux of the situation.
Yeah, amen. Wow. Well, that leads perfectly into the last question I'd like to explore is, in coming to terms with the cascading problems of overshoot, resource depletion, climate breakdown, et cetera, et cetera. Have you encountered stages of grieving that went beyond mere acceptance? In other words, what for you has opened up on the other side of the post-doom doorway? What gifts do you experience? And how do you stay inspired to do the work that you do on a day-by-day basis?
I don't have anything super insightful to say on that point. I think Joanna Macy has so much eloquence to offer on that question. I find just connecting with, being with, talking with other people who have that same perspective, who understand what we've been talking about for the last hour, is probably the most regenerative thing that I have going in my life. I mean, obviously, you mentioned I play the violin. I love music. I think, if human life is worth preserving, then we should focus on what makes it worth preserving, And one of those things is that we are capable of producing great beauty. And so I think the arts are, if everybody just spent their time making beautiful music and beautiful stuff and beautiful relationships and appreciating the beauty of nature, rather than, focusing on making as much money as they can, or as powerful weapons as they can, or whatever, the next iPhone, or you name it, the world would be a better place.